Hey, what's your name? Where are you calling from?
First caller here. Hey, what's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hi, this is Dan from California.
Hey, Dan, just turn the stream down, like the YouTube stream or the Twitch stream, wherever you're listening, and just listen through Skype. I see you're using a video. Can I pull your video on the feed?
Yeah, sure.
Cool, cool. Give me 1 second. And all right, here we go. Hey, Dan from California. What would you like to talk about?
Well, I am a big Ayn Rand fan, so
Oh,
I assume that we have pretty different views on a lot of things. And I
we
was
do.
interested to, yeah. So I was interested to debate or discuss that.
Cool. Let's. What is there a specific topic in general you want to discuss? I think that's probably the best way to go about this. Pick something in particular that and we could just talk about that.
Okay, well, I can just say very briefly, just a quick nutshell of her philosophy. She's pro-reason, so that sets her apart from conservatives in their religious kind of approach. She's pro-egoism and pro-individualism, so I think that sets her apart from both the left and the right. I think there's a lot of collectivism on both sides. And then also she's pro-capitalism, so that again makes her pretty distinctive in the landscape of political views. So if there's anything on that menu that piques your interest, I'd be happy to talk about it.
I mean, generally, like I feel like she actually fits a lot of like that description fits a lot of conservatives nowadays, where they espouse this sort of um, uh, you know self-sustaining, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. The responsibility is all yours, but then, of course, you find out that they themselves are sucking on the government teat, so to say, and are getting help, but just refuse to admit that they are, because I guess it's different when they do, such as Ayn Rand, who lived her final days on, taking Social Security, which nothing wrong with that. That's perfect. That's what it's there for.
Well, I have a video on my YouTube channel exactly about that. So Ayn Rand, she's often criticized and I would say smeared for taking Social Security, but the way she thought of it is she's just getting money back that was stolen from her. So that money was hers by rights. The government did not have a right to take that away from her. So it's just getting her money back. It's not living off of someone else's dime. It's getting her own dime back. So I don't think there's any problem with that.
Now, I mean, did she? I mean, she
She
knew
wrote
that
an
the
article
money.
on that too, by the way. She has an
Uh,
article discussing this issue.
I mean, she knows that the money wasn't. She knew that the money that she had put into Social Security wasn't just sitting there waiting for her, and also she probably didn't get out exactly what she put in. I'm assuming.
I don't know how much she put in,
All
but
right.
she died wealthy. She left, I think, like $500,000 to her heir. So the idea that she died broke and on welfare is it's just a myth. It's ridiculous, and it's used to smear her. So I think that needs to be made very clear. But I think the important thing here is the government has no right to take this money away from any individual. No one should be forced to sacrifice for other people. That's an essential part of her philosophy. And so there's nothing inconsistent or hypocritical about what she did.
I mean, she did rail against any redistribution of wealth whatsoever, and I mean that's basically. I mean, to say like I put my money in, I mean that's taxes. Every redistribution of wealth that as we know it is practically the citizens put their pay taxes and the money is distributed via various different programs or infrastructure or whatever. I mean, it seems like a way to explain away that she took Social Security.
Well, she's born into this system. It wasn't up to her that, well, she wasn't born in it. She actually immigrated from Russia, which went communist when she was living there. She was 12 years old, I think, when the Bolshevik Revolution happened in 1917. And the communists, I believe they took over her father's pharmacy, which is what they had used, and then they were reduced to poverty, and her life was miserable under the communists. And then she escaped to America in 1926. And then shortly after that, the New Deal started, and America started implementing policies that were similar to what she had fled from. But she came to a system, and she didn't. It was more free market back in those days, but it became less free market with the rise of the New Deal, and then later the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson. The growth of governments, the government grew massively after she came here. But she doesn't believe in majority rules, unlimited majority rules, where you can just get a mob together and vote away the rights of minorities. She thinks people have individual rights, and no one should be able to vote away anyone else's property or wealth.
Well, just before we get too far from this, I want to make sure I don't exactly think the New Deal is anywhere near the USSR. So I don't think
it's not that bad, but it's a step on the way there.
I don't know about bad, but she didn't come exactly. I don't think it's a step either. But let's actually talk about a specific, because I don't really want to go back and forth on Ayn Rand, because the point of Ayn, to bring up Ayn Rand is her beliefs, and I prefer to do that. And I assume your beliefs too, being that you're a fan of hers. I prefer to talk about current policy instead of just talking about Ayn Rand's day, because I think that's more important. So is there a specific policy or program or issue you want to bring up, and we could just focus on that for this discussion in terms of something you disagree with or don't think should be, or wish that something was? Throw something out there.
Okay. Well, I wish we were a laissez-faire capitalist society. So that would mean no taxes at all, which means, because they're coercive. I mean, that follows from the basic principles of her philosophy. She thinks people should deal with each other on a voluntary basis. So I shouldn't be forced to give my money to someone else. If I want to voluntarily help somebody, if I want to help pay for somebody's education or healthcare, if I'm their relative, maybe they're a close friend and I want to help them out, I should be able to choose to use my money in that way. But I don't think I should be forced to help other people. And I shouldn't be, threatened with jail if I don't choose to do that with money. So taxes, that's one issue we could talk about.
So you would just do zero taxes, no taxes at all.
Right. I think the government should exist, but it should be funded by voluntary means, not coercive means. I think it's important to have a government, but it should be funded by voluntary means and restricted much more than it is today. Today, it's doing all kinds of things that I don't think it's the proper role of government to be doing.
All right, so we know that the very wealthy in this country, who hoard massive amounts of wealth, that they do everything possible to pay as little in taxes as possible as they can. So what if under this voluntary system, the richest in this country, the 1%, let's say, decide that they're just not going to pay taxes at all, and so you have this massive hoarding of wealth. And they obviously just going to continue to get richer, and they're not contributing anything whatsoever. How would we fund anything? How would that work?
Well, I don't think it's in people's self-interest to fund nothing. I mean, it's in rich people's interests. It's in poor people's interests to have a peaceful, safe society. You don't want criminals running around robbing, raping, murdering people. So it's in everybody's, at least every rational person's self-interest, to support a government, to have a police force, to have an army to protect you from foreign invaders, to have a court system to peacefully settle disputes. If you didn't have those institutions of government, things would just perhaps reduce to anarchy, and that would be horrible. So I think it's in people's rational self-interest to support these functions of government.
But
so
you're really depending on people to do this out of the kindness of their hearts, and we've already seen, let's take I don't think rich people would honestly pay in taxes voluntarily, because we know that when COVID happened, a number of them just got the fuck out of Dodge and got on their big yacht and lived their lives in the middle of the water. We know that very rich people are buying up land in in New Zealand, for example, and other far away places, and basically just building themselves little fortresses in case shit did go down. Like, they obviously don't care. Like, they've already laid out the opportunity. They've already laid it out that when the opportunity presents itself, they're out of here. They're not gonna they're not sticking it out and fighting for everybody. They're gone, and that's with them paying taxes. Now imagine if they didn't have to, they'd be gone.
Well, I think if people had the opportunity to choose what to do with their money, they would be more benevolent with it. Like, if I'm a rich person, I might not give any money to charity because half of my income is already being forcibly taken away from me. But if I have that 50% of my income, or however much to choose what to do with, then I would more likely help people out of benevolence. And I think people did this to a certain extent. There were mutual aid societies in the 19th century before the welfare state grew as large as it is today. I mean, America has a long history. It's not like, and it became super prosperous. You had millions of immigrants from around the world fleeing to America because of its freedom and its opportunities. This is before there was a massive welfare state. So I don't think people are going to be without any means to survive without taxes.
Why do you think the welfare state it was created? Like, why do you think these government welfare programs were created? Like, why do you think FDR instituted the New Deal? Like, why do you think these things were they deemed necessary?
Yeah, I think America has, the intellectuals in particular, have been very heavily influenced by European philosophy, going back to Kant and Hegel and Marx. That was the vanguard in the philosophy world. And a lot of American intellectuals were influenced by those ideas. Bismarck, I think, he introduced the welfare state in Germany, and it spread to other parts of Europe, I believe, and eventually to America. But I don't think it was out of necessity. I think it was out of their philosophical preconvictions that this was an appropriate sort of society to invent.
Wait,
but
so
America had been.
You think everything was going great? Rich people were just passing their money around to anyone who needed help. And then all of a sudden, just because of ideological reasons, FDR and various other world leaders decided to institute these welfare programs when everything was just hunky-dory. There was no necessity for it whatsoever during those time periods.
No, I don't think there was any necessity. And as I mentioned before, there was millions of immigrants coming here. I mean, if this were such a horrible place and people are dying in the streets because they can't support themselves, why would so many people from around the earth be flocking to the United States to live here if it was such a horrible place? They were escaping worse places where they had less freedom and less opportunity. And America had explosive growth. They had tremendous progress in the 19th century. And that's a period that's often smeared. We hear people like Rockefeller called the robber barons. But I think there's a lot of mythology that people are taught about that era. And if they were taught different facts about those eras, they have a much different evaluation.
I mean, there was a lot of death. And a lot of homelessness, and a lot of people on the streets before programs like the New Deal were instituted. Like, we're talking about like the era of the Great Depression. A lot of people.
No, Great Depression is much later. That's a 20th century phenomenon caused by government intervention in effect. That's another one of these myths. It's often attributed to free market capitalism.
Well, I'm talking about the New Deal. The New Deal. That did not happen later.
Yeah, that was 20th century, 1930s, FDR. This is after they instituted an income tax, after they created the Federal Reserve, which could print all this fiat currency, manipulate the market rates. When they had a freer system, there were some panics and runs on banks in the 19th century, but not to the extent of a Great Depression. And even those panics in the 19th century were caused by lack of free banking. If you read some free market historians or economists on this, you can learn about how systems like in Scotland or Canada, where they had actually a freer system economically and in the banking industry, they didn't have these panics that periodically happened in the United States. But even with those, things were still so good that millions of immigrants would come here. So, and if you look at a graph, like in terms of life expectancy, it's like a hockey stick. In the 1800s, this is when, like after the Industrial Revolution, life expectancy skyrockets, standard of living skyrockets. So there was a correlation between prosperity and freedom. So I think it's the exact opposite of the picture that people often portray, which is this is a time of despair and everything is going terrible. Actually, it was a time of huge progress, which is why it was such a magnet to people all around the world.
So what are your feelings on? So you think there should be a government, but it should be all run voluntarily.
Right.
So what do you think the government's role is other than military? Is that basically it?
So the basic role of the government is to protect people from force, and that's it. So that's why it has a police system. That's another thing. So to protect people from domestic criminals who would use force, like robbers or rapists or murderers. And then in addition to the police, for domestic criminals and domestic force, you have an army or a military to protect people from foreign invaders who would come here and conquer us or enslave us. And then the third basic function, in addition to police and military, is the court system, which is to settle disputes among people, even peaceful citizens living in the same country, in order, if they have a dispute about something, instead of settling it by resorting to fisticuffs, the courts allow a peaceful mechanism to resolve their disputes, so they don't have to resort to force. And those are basically the only three functions of government. It's to extract force from society. But everything beyond that, like forcibly taking people's money, taking Peter's money and giving it to Paul, making Peter pay for Paul's education or healthcare or whatever, all that's illegitimate. That's bringing force back in to society, whereas the proper purpose of government, on Rand's view, is to extract force and allow people to have peaceful, voluntary associations.
Okay, so basically, you just think it should be a police force, military, things like that. So what about labor laws? You don't think those should exist?
Right, like minimum wage, for instance, whatever price of labor you want, that should be a voluntary agreement between an employer and employee. The government has no business as a third party interfering with the voluntary arrangements of employer and employee.
What about child labor?
That's something that parents should have a role in, because if a parent, this is actually something that was necessary back in the early days. It's actually a luxury today that we don't have to have our kids labor, but it was a survival necessity prior to the Industrial Revolution. But since then, we've become so wealthy that it hasn't been necessary for parents to have their children work. But if a kid wants to walk a dog for money or something, or rake leaves or mow lawns or sell lemonade at a lemonade stand, they should be able to do that. And
kids can do that today. We're talking about kids, not being able to work in the mines, the coal mines, and in like slaughterhouses and stuff. That's what we're talking about when we talk about child labor laws, not some kid setting up a lemonade stand.
Yeah, there's a book called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal by Ayn Rand, where there's a section on child labor. And it's discussed in there, like there were children who were chimney sweeps. And I think there might have been some government intervention involved in the child labor that there was. As opposed to free market causing it. I don't remember exactly everything it says in the essay about that. But some of the jobs were like in a factory, they would have the children tie knots like on a loom or something if a thread breaks. Pretty trivial labor. But these types of jobs, they're not awesome, but what are you going to compare it to? Are we comparing it to a pre-industrial society where you have to do back-breaking labor from, dawn to dusk? Or are we talking about a advanced 21st century? I don't think we can apply the standards today and then say, well, it's terrible that people should ever have to do that at any point in history.
But I'm not trying to apply the standards of today to. I'm not compare. I'm talking about this is your views in terms of what you would like to see today. So I'm not like that's why I wanted to talk about things like this. It's. I guess it could be fun talking about Ayn Rand specifically and the era she lived in the past. But for me, it's more practical in terms of talking about, you said you don't think today we should have taxes. And you tell me also you don't think that there should be labor laws and child labor laws included today. And to me, that's not like looking back at the past. We're talking about modern day. I think, when you say that we today have the luxury of not having to have children in the coal mines, I mean, that quote unquote luxury comes from things like welfare programs and the state.
I don't think so.
I mean, you don't think that has anything to do with it? You don't think the fact that
No.
Ma and Pa doesn't have to send little Junior to the factory instead of like letting them get educated because there's no programs to help save them and put food on the table if they're in dire straits? You don't think there's no correlation there?
I don't think it's thanks to government that child labor has been eradicated, or at least some forms of it have been eradicated. And this is something that's discussed in that book I mentioned. It's after that free markets have evolved to a certain extent that's to the extent that child labor is no longer necessary, that it was then legislated, at least in some places, and made illegal to have children work in certain places. Also, like I've heard this is true of like the I don't know if it's the 40-hour work week or the 8-hour day, or the certain wages paying. Like Henry Ford, he had he doubled the wages of the people that worked for him at a certain point. And it was after that there were, I guess, there were wage laws instituted. But it's only after the free market can support a certain level that the government then comes down and mandates that. But I don't think it's from the government from the get-go that it's not thanks to the government that it came to be in the first place, that we got to a certain standard of living or got to the point where we didn't need child labor. That was after the fact.
Well, some of these things aren't like the government doing it from the goodness of their heart from the get-go. A lot of these things were due to people getting together and putting political force on the government to get these things done. For example, a lot of labor laws are thanks to unions. What are your feelings on unions?
I think unions are fine as long as they're voluntary. So the problem is when they use government coercion to get their way or to force a company to the bargaining table. That's what I think is wrong. So I think if you start a business, you're the owner of this business. It's your right to run the business as you choose. And if you don't want to have a union, you don't want to deal with the union's demands, you don't want to bargain with the union, well, I think because it's your property, it's your business, you shouldn't be forced by the government to bargain or negotiate with the union. If you want to allow a union, maybe you think it's in your self-interest to have a union, maybe you think your employees will be happier that way, you'll have better employee retention, then you can have a union. So I just think it should be up to the free decision of the people involved. It shouldn't be the government stepping in and coercing people.
You could have misspoke, so I want to make it clear, though. I know you mentioned the government. You don't believe the government should get involved with a unionization and labor when it comes to that. But I also caught you saying that you don't think a company or a business owner should feel like they need to go to a bargaining table with a union. Now, if the government's not involved and the workforce unionizes voluntarily, you're fine though with a company having no choice but to sit at a bargaining table with its workers.
Well, I'm not sure I follow the example, because if you say the union organizes voluntarily, well, they can do that. But if that's against the rules of the company's owner, then they can't do that. I mean, at that point, the company can fire the people who try to organize voluntarily. Like if it's in their contract that they're not allowed to form a union, then they try to form a union, then at that point they can be fired. And the government shouldn't stop the company, because that would be the government interfering forcibly with the company and violating the property rights of the company owner.
All right. So, okay. So, all right. Let's talk about. All right. I got to bring this one up because you mentioned the child labor laws. Where do you land on age of consent?
Age of consent. Okay, so I mean, I think there's a distinction between adults and children, and which country draws where countries draw that line might vary. In some countries, in the United States, it's 18. In other countries, it might be a little higher, a little bit lower. But there's obviously a distinction between children and adults, and I don't think adults. I don't think children can be, wherever we do to draw the line for legal
Who
purposes,
makes that
people below that
distinction?
line shouldn't have to. They can't give consents. You have to be an adult to give
Right, but
consents.
who makes that distinction though? Where is the line? Who draws the line? Who makes that distinction in a world where everything's voluntary and the government's only there to protect people's property and safety?
Well, there's a legislature, which is elected. I think that would be, and I didn't mention them before, in addition to like the police, military, and court system. But there's also some other things the government does, like have a legislature. They have to create the laws. And I guess maybe this is an example of one thing that a legislature would do, which is elected by the people. They would come up with some age of consent. And at this point, you're deemed an adult, and at that point, you're legally responsible. You're no longer considered under the guardianship of somebody else. And, they would need to come up with something reasonable. And if they don't, then if a country becomes so corrupt as the founding fathers deemed Britain to be, then you can overthrow the government. You can have a revolution like the Americans did in the American Revolution. So if someone tries to set up an age of consent of like 5 years old, that's ridiculous. And then I would try to overthrow that government. But I don't think that's really going to be a problem. I think, people just get together, choose a reasonable age.
I personally do think, obviously the example of age of consent being 5 is ridiculous because 5-year-olds are children, and they cannot consent. But I mean, in your scenario, it sounds like in this libertarian paradise, the government
not libertarian, not libertarian, objectivist. I distinguish that from libertarian. Ayn Rand called her philosophy objectivism, so she was very keen to distinguish herself from the libertarians.
What is the difference between objectionists and libertarians? Can you explain the difference between those two? Objectivists and libertarians.
Yeah. So one key difference, by the way, this is Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff, her most famous students. So one key difference is Objectivism is an entire philosophy, so it's not just a political philosophy. There's a metaphysics, a view about the basic nature of reality. There's an epistemology, a view about the nature of knowledge. There's an ethical system, rational egoism. And then on top of that entire philosophical foundation, there's a political philosophy of laissez-faire capitalism, individual rights. And that's the point where libertarianism comes in, or people who call themselves libertarians, but they don't have the entire foundation. And some of them are anarchists. I think many of them are anarchists, and they don't really understand what true liberty is. And they actually, on these issues like consent, they think it's a violation. Some of them think it is a violation of liberty or freedom if you say you're not allowed to have sex with a child. They think that's a violation of liberty. I think that's a distorted understanding of what liberty is. So that's this kind of example is one reason I like to distinguish libertarianism from the philosophy I subscribe to, objectivism, or at least in large part. So it's not anarchists, and it's an entire system of philosophy. Objectivism is. Those are the two key distinctions I would draw between objectivism and libertarianism.
All right. Where do you land on basic regulations? Let's throw this one out here because this is a famous clip that always makes its way around from one of the Libertarian Party conventions. In the objectivist world, in the objectivist nation, are there seatbelt laws, for example?
No. So there would be private roads, first of all. And if you're the road owner or part of a consortium of people who own the roads, you would set the rules for the road. And maybe you would require seatbelts on your road if you're a given owner. Maybe there's a different owner who doesn't. Maybe that's, most would find it in their self-interest to have seatbelt rules on their own roads to minimize accidents and damages. But it wouldn't be a government matter. It would be a private matter.
So you think that all roads should be private?
Yeah.
There should be no interstates, highways, things connecting various states for even for the laissez-faire capitalism economy. Like, you don't think there's any sort of general benefit in having a government that make sure that interstate commerce can happen. That for example, a truck driver can deliver goods from a company in California to consumers in Iowa.
I mean, it's certainly a value to have roads like that, but I think for that very reason, there would be a profit incentive. There would be an incentive for venture capitalists, industrialists to construct such roads and get a return on their investment. I mean, there were private railroads back in the 19th century that competed with government railroads and actually did it much more efficiently and better. I think J.J. Hill, who ran the railroad up in the Pacific Northwest, is a good example of this. He didn't get subsidies like many of the other railroad companies, and so it's not necessary to have governments intervene to have large infrastructure. You just need the profit motive.
Well, so what if in this world, it seems like it would be very difficult to be a small business owner, which seems to be sort of also like the lifeblood of this objectivist view, right? I mean, Walmart, for example, they own all the privatized roads, and you run a competing business, and they just choose to not let you drive on their roads, and you have no way to basically do anything, and then you get monopolies. No?
I don't think there's going to be one company. I don't know how it would evolve, but at least a priori, I don't have reason to think that there's going to be one company like Walmart who owns all the roads and for some crazy reason doesn't want to let anyone drive on it or only wants to let a select few.
I mean, would you say we have a lot of regulation in this country today? Like we have big government?
Yeah, I would say so.
And with all of this regulation and big government, there are a lot of there are very few big companies, I should say, very few big companies, a elite class of mega corporations that basically run various industries. And that's with all this regulation, with all these antitrust laws. You don't think of, even without those regulations, seeing what happens with regulation, you don't think without these regulations, without these antitrust laws, it would be even worse?
I think it would be better without antitrust laws. I think antitrust laws, they stifle innovation. I mean, they put businessmen in this position where you can get, they're non-objective laws. There's a passage I could look up if there's a great quote from Ayn Rand, but it's something to the effect of, if you set your prices the same as your competitors, you can get be penalized for collusion. If you set your prices below your competitors, you can be penalized for I don't know what the term she uses, for trying to undercut and I don't know what term it is.
I'm not sure
but
exactly
if you set it
the
above,
examples.
you can also be penalized. So no matter what price you set your good at in relation to your consumers, you can be criminalized. So the laws, the antitrust laws, are completely arbitrary and non-objective. There's no way to follow them, and it leads to paralysis. You have to ignore them, or what I think sometimes happens is you have to lobby the government. So when you have these regulatory laws, it creates an incentive to have a lobby agency in Washington. Whereas if you didn't have these, if the government didn't have the power, this arbitrary power over companies, you wouldn't need lobbyists over the government. So I think it stifles innovation and makes businessmen incapable or less capable of innovating. But even with all the regulations, we've still had huge companies like Amazon or Google become massive players in the market. But I think they've done tremendous good. I think people like Jeff Bezos, they've become super rich. But I think the reason is because they've created some awesome products that millions or billions of people benefit from. So we voluntarily give them our money. We subscribe to Prime or whatever. We use their services, and then they benefit as a result. So it's a win-win kind of relation.
Well, you also know that Amazon takes advantage of the, for example, the wonderful service that the U.S. postal system offers. A lot of Amazon deliveries, regardless of whether it's Amazon delivering it or FedEx or whomever, for certain areas, they actually hand it off to the United States Postal Service to finish the delivery because it's more efficient and convenient and cost-saving for them to do so.
Now, USPS, that's a monopoly. That's a bad kind of monopoly, I would say, because that's a government coercive monopoly. So FedEx and UPS are not free to compete with USPS when it comes to certain kind of parcels of mail.
What do you feel about?
And
How do you feel about the? How do you feel about the U.S. Constitution?
I think it's a great document, but it's not perfect. I think it has flaws in it. Of course, slavery was allowed from the beginning. I think that was a huge flaw. Fortunately, it was eradicated. Also, the power to tax, I think, is a flaw. So it's not a perfect document, but compared to what existed in any previous country, I think was a huge step forward. And it's the intellectual foundation that allowed America to prosper as much as it has, and is to become super wealthy, the wealthiest country in history. I would say the greatest country in history in terms of its respect for individual rights, which, as I mentioned before, I think is what has attracted so many people to America. Unfortunately, I think we're much less open in terms of immigration than we used to be. It's so hard now for people to immigrate. I think it often takes years. People who aren't criminals.
Wait, I think we might. I think we might. I think we. Hold on. I think we. I brought up the Constitution things. I wanted to bring up how the Postal Service is actually explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, and it's actually a completely self-funded service. It doesn't get any government money. It completely runs on the service that it provides, the payment it receives for the service it provides from the people who use it. But you brought up the immigration thing, and I think we might be coming across something that we agree upon. So you think it is too hard to immigrate to this country, and you think we should let more immigrants into the United States?
Yeah, I don't think that there should be any barrier to entry for people who are not posing any kind of physical threat. So if they're not a criminal, they're not a terrorist, they're not carrying some kind of deadly disease with them, then they should be allowed in. There's people in this country have no rights. I mean, the country as a whole is not private property. If you're on the border, if you have a property right on the border, then you can keep people off your parcel of land. But the country as a whole is not private property. And I don't think any individual in this country has a right to keep others out, and so that they don't have to compete with cheaper labor coming in. If people from Mexico or wherever want to pick apples for a cheaper price, and I want to hire them, let's say I'm in America and I want to hire some of this cheap labor, I should be free to do so, and they should be free to come in. And to interfere with that voluntary relationship is to violate the rights both of me as an American and of the person who would come here and work.
As someone who's pro-immigration and as someone who sees the benefits in having immigrants come here, and immigrants are usually very hard working, much more hardworking than Americans. I'll tell you that. Do you think that in order to create a situation that allows everything you just mentioned that you're for to happen, that the U.S. government should provide services to help immigrants, especially those who are seeking a sanctuary here from a brutal, maybe a country they're escaping? Do you believe the government should step in and provide some sort of even temporary aid to immigrants?
No, I don't think aid. I think that's the role of private charity. So if you, as a private citizen, wants to help out some of these immigrants, or if I do, then we should be free to use our money to help these people out. But what we shouldn't be doing is being forced by the government to help out anyone else, whether it's someone in America. So I think we should get rid of welfare for Americans, but we should also not have welfare for foreign immigrants who come in. And I think that's one of the reasons conservatives are opposed to immigration. They make up this excuse. They say, like, well, if you have these immigrants coming in, they're going to be sucking off the government teat, and we can't afford that. Well, I don't think Americans should be sucking off the government teat. No one should be able to rely on forcible, coercive means to support themselves. But as private citizens, we should all be free to help out these people.
So who is this immigrant, though, who simultaneously needs to come to the U.S., but they can afford to move themselves and all their belongings and their entire family to the U.S. They can afford to do that, but they also, once they get here, have to, pick apples for $1 an hour. Like, who is this immigrant who could afford the immigration, but then has to work these slave wage, below minimum wage jobs? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, do you see? Like, it is like you don't see the hypocrisy there that that who is this person that can afford to do this, but also needs to work for this menial income? Like, I don't see it. I don't see it. Like, the people who come to this country now, like in reality, and have to do these low paying jobs. It's because they come here and they're usually provided with housing and some sort of bare minimum living standard, just so they can exist.
I don't think it's necessary. No, I don't think it's necessary. And I think the 19th century showed this. I mean, we didn't have government programs to help out immigrants coming from Europe in the 19th century, yet we had millions of them coming here. I think that's the same thing with Mexicans coming today. They don't need the government to help. All they need is freedom and opportunity. I think that's what they want most deeply. And these people want it so bad. I've heard they swim through shark-infested waters, maybe coming from communist Cuba, to try to get to the United States. They risk their lives. Sometimes they lose their lives, very tragically. So no, you don't need the government to prop them up. You just need the government to get out of their way, let them in, and then protect the rule of law once they get here. And I think private charity, if they will be abundantly available to help them out, especially if you're not taking away so much of people's wealth through taxation. It's not being siphoned away for these other causes. You can use it to help out people who are immigrating, perhaps, or for whatever other uses you want to put to it. But no, I don't. I have more confidence in immigrants. I don't think they need handouts from the government in order to survive. I think they just need working opportunities, and I think they are willing to do that.
I mean, I just don't see like, you don't think there's even a transition phase, like like. I'm just trying to understand.
They could set that up. They move one family member over there, and they can get on his feet, and then move another family member. It can happen gradually. It might rely on friends to help him out, but I think all this can be done by private means, and it's immoral, I think, and counterproductive to set up a system of coercion to try to get these people on their feet. I think that's violating a principle that it sets a bad precedent, and there's not really a principled way to stop it. Once you introduce some coercion, there's no ground. Like income tax, it used to be very low. It was a scandal when the income tax was first introduced, at just a few percent. And now, decades later, where most people are paying like over 20 or 30%. So these things are, it might seem crazy to you now. If you look back in history, the way things used to be, it seems much more reasonable and doable and realistic.
Right. I mean, wasn't the top income tax rate in this country something like above 90%, and it was during the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, where people look fondly back on as the peak of the American middle class? No?
There was a period, I don't know how long it lasted, but yeah, I've heard there was a period where the top income bracket was taxed at over 90% or over that. But no, I don't see that as a golden era. I think productivity, I think the rate of progress and increase in productivity, I think it's slowed down over the course of the 20th century. I think we had explosive growth in the 19th century, all kinds of innovation, the airplane, the car, the electronics. And there's been some innovation since then. Of course, the technology we're using right now to have this conversation, the internet, YouTube, but this is in the sector that's been, I think, one of the least regulated sectors, the tech sector. And I don't want it to be regulated because I think that'll slow down its progress. It'll make it lag in the way that I think other sectors of the economy have lagged. I think that there's been much less progress in the medical healthcare field, which I think is tremendously regulated. But I think we would have much more progress there. In some cases, we have actually gone backwards. Like we used to have supersonic travel, the Concorde airline back in the 80s or 90s. We had that for a brief time, then it went out of off the market, and we don't have supersonic travel now. Someone's trying to bring it back. There's a company called Boom, which is creating supersonic flight again. And maybe in like 10 years, they'll actually it'll be on the market again. But in some ways, we've retrogressed. We haven't merely stagnated, we've gone backwards. But I think if we got rid of all the regulations and we had a truly free market, we would rocket forward in terms of our progress.
You mentioned health medicine, and you keep bringing up the 19th century as like it seems like you think the 19th century was like the peak era in terms of at least your ideological beliefs. Wasn't there also simultaneously a lot of disease and during the 19th century? Like, wasn't that the age of pandemics and various different contagious diseases running rampant through the streets of this country?
Well, I think there was some of that, but there was also cures to that. Like Louis Pasteur, he had discovered, that, I don't know what all the details of it. Was it some kind of penicillin, or I don't know what it was, but some of the diseases that have been scourges of humanity for centuries were finally eradicated due to the science that was developed in the 19th century. And we got vaccines like the polio vaccine later on, malaria, and DDT, pesticides to spray on plants I think that was to eradicate malaria. And we had basically eradicated, but I think it's come back. I think, unfortunately, it's starting to come back in some places because of the environmentalist movement, which I think is an anti-progress, anti-industrial sort of movement based on false science. I think there's a lot of pseudoscience behind the environmentalist movement. This comes up with the whole climate change issue and global warming and all that. Here I have a great reference for you, or your audience, Alex Epstein. I think he's done great work in the area of energy and climates, environmental issues. I think there's been a lot of pseudoscience which has held back progress, and I think we'd be much further afford. So yeah, you go back in the 19th century, you might see more diseases, but I think those started to be eradicated and would be eradicated more and at a faster rate if we had more freedom to combat those sorts of diseases. We had less regulations. I think this applied to COVID too. I think the government had a pretty bad response to that. If we had a more free system, I think the FDA was holding things back, which maybe could have saved many, many, many lives if there weren't this laborious approval process. If people could experimentally take drugs instead of having to wait for a bureaucrat's permission to take a drug. So I think there would be all kinds of improvements in the healthcare sector if we had more freedom there.
All right, this is I want to bring up more topics. Why don't we save this for another day? Why don't we? I would love for you to call back in. This was very illuminating, very interesting. Always enjoy debating with people who disagree. Although I think it was a more, a more casual conversation we had. I do think we found a common ground where this country should let more immigrants in, although we disagree with various things that surround that. But Dan, thanks for calling in, and please feel free to call back in anytime.
I really appreciate it, Matt. And one final question. I mentioned I had a YouTube channel. It's at Dan Norton 1, if anyone wants to check it out. But I was wondering if maybe I could post a clip of this call to my channel, if you would be okay with that.
Yeah, sure. Feel free. No problem at all.
Great. All right. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate your time.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
That was fun. I want more people to call in who don't agree with me. And that was, I think I probably should have left the medicine one for another day. I think at that point I was like, all right, it's time for another caller. But definitely call in again, Dan.